In this video we are going to be discussing defensive driving. So, defensive driving is a system of vehicle control that aims to ensure that the driver of a vehicle is always prepared for any hazards that may arise. And the system is broken down into 5 steps: search, identify, predict, decide, and finally execute. We'll go through these steps one at a time. The first step is search. Now, when we think back to when we first started to drive, we were hyper vigilant about everything we saw. Everything on the road could be a possible hazard. But as time went on and became more familiar with driving, we start to become complacent. Now you can see, as we start learning how to drive, we start gaining confidence and our skills grow, but it gets to the point where it plateaus. We've mastered the skills, but unfortunately we now become very familiar with driving and complacency sets in, and we actually start becoming dangerous drivers. We start to eat while we are driving, something we'd never do when we first started. Makeup on in the car. And probably the worst of all, texting while we drive. As we become more complacent, we stop scanning for all potential hazards, and our focus area becomes smaller. Often, drivers will simply keep their eyes on the vehicle in front of them. Here's a short video of what the average driver sees when they drive through traffic. The little red block that you can see is basically the driver watching the vehicle in front of them. The issue with this is, a lot is happening on the sides and around the driver that they will be totally unaware of. Now, look at the difference when we broaden our view, and let's see what hazards we might have potentially missed. By broadening our view, suddenly, here we can see a man with a wheelbarrow, another pedestrian very well hidden in shadows, and because we are watching the vehicle in front of us, we've actually gone through a red robot, and again a pedestrian about to step into the road. Defensive driving starts with searching. We need to search for any possible hazards that may arise as we drive. A good defensive driver will continually scan the area, not focusing on just one thing, but actively scanning for hazards. This includes checking your periphery as well as your mirrors to give you a good 360-degree vision of what's happening around you. Let's move on to the second step, which is identify. The identify process in defensive driving is to identify any potential hazards. And these hazards fall into 2 classes: potential hazards and developing hazards. So, what's the difference between these 2 hazards? Well, potential hazards is exactly what it says. A potential hazard, you may have to take evasive action, such as braking or steering or accelerating to avoid the hazard, but no action is needed at present. Let's look at a short video clip to show a potential hazard. Here you can see, as we're driving, we've got a pedestrian on the side of the road. That's a potential hazard. They might step into our path or try and run across the road. We need to be aware of this hazard, but we don't need to take any action at this time. Now, developing hazard is one that requires you to take evasive action, such as braking, accelerating, steering, whatever you need to do to avoid the hazard. Again, let's watch a little video. This vehicle's brake lights come on. This represents a developing hazard because we've had to make an action. We've had to start applying our own brakes. Otherwise, obviously, we'd crash into this vehicle. To complicate matters, a potential hazard can become a developing hazard, and often you'll deal with multiple hazards of different kinds. So in the next short video, we will label potential hazards with an orange ring and developing hazards in a red ring. Preference is always given to developing hazards, while keeping potential hazards in view to ensure that they too do not become a developing hazard. So let's move on to the next step, which is predict. Predict. Now that we've identified our hazards, we need to predict what these hazards may or may not do and how it will affect us. Let's have a closer look at one of the previous videos. Here we can see we're coming down the road. We've identified a potential hazard. We now need to predict what that pedestrian might do. There's a good chance they might try to run across the road in front of us. And you can see, watch what happens as we approach this pedestrian. They actually start walking into our path and becoming more of a hazard. Now, let's move on to the next one, which is decide. Basically, we've searched for the hazards, we've identified them as potential or developing, we predicted what might happen. Now it's time to decide what we're going to do to mitigate that hazard. It can also be seen as a preparation stage. If we take the example of the pedestrian we just discussed, our decision should always take the form of, if this happens, this is what I'm going to do. So here we have a number of options. For example, if the pedestrian starts walking, I will hoot and make her aware of the danger she is in. Another example, if the pedestrian starts walking, I will have to brake. So be sure to check your rear mirror to make sure that it's actually safe to do so. The whole idea here is that you're prepared for what is to come. In other words, you're being defensive. The average driver would have been unaware of the pedestrian, and if she did run in front of the vehicle, would have had little to no time to react. This type of driver is known as a reactive driver. And if they had run over the pedestrian, they would certainly state, "It happened so fast, she came out of nowhere and I had no time to react." So let's move on to the final stage of defensive driving, which is execute. The final stage is all about execution. If you prepared yourself to mitigate the hazard, stick to your plan and do it. Humans are intrinsically optimistic, and when encountering potential hazards will often brush them off as, "It shouldn't be a problem, it's not going to affect me." But if you've gone to the trouble of searching for hazards, identifying them, predicting what they might do, deciding what you're going to do, do it.